It's really an honor to share the podium with so many distinguished public servants. And as a mere academic, I will do my best to try and do what academics do, which is provide some context for events. We've already gotten into discussion of the Middle East, and I think that's inevitable because of the prominence of this region of the world in American foreign policy, both historically and, of course, at the present moment. What I want to do right now is not focus so much on immediate events, although I'm very happy in the discussion to talk about Israeli elections, Palestinian politics, and so on. But as I said, I do want to try and provide some context about the broader trends and forces in the region that are really driving the events we're reading about in the newspaper. At the end of the Oslo process, the Oslo peace process, nearly 10 years ago, when things fell apart, many of us who worked on the issue, I think, consoled ourselves with the thought that if we hadn't achieved a comprehensive peace in the Middle East, we had at least succeeded in transforming this conflict in some fundamental ways. Transforming it in particular from a regional, an Arab-Israeli conflict that had led to 5 wars since 1948, and transforming it into a series of bilateral conflicts, localized, more manageable. A Syrian-Israeli conflict, a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And with Egypt and Jordan having signed peace treaties with Israel, we expected that the fight over the Holy Land would never again become an arena for regional war, as it had been in the 20th century. I'm sorry to tell you today that I think we may have been wrong. Today, the conflict between Arabs and Jews in the Holy Land is regionalized to a degree I don't think any of us would have predicted 10 years ago. Because of the consequences of the war in Iraq, because of other broader regional developments, the Arab-Israeli conflict today is once again caught up in regional dynamics and is increasingly subject to forces from well beyond its borders. Now, obviously, this has very negative implications for the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But a further implication is that the links between this problem of Palestine and the region's other crises, these links that are often debated in Washington and across the United States, these links, I think, are more concrete, more evident, more inescapable than ever before. And I think that makes American policy on the issue of Israel and Palestine more important than ever to American interests. And you heard that last night from General Scowcroft. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is outline for you how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become regionalized, paying particular attention to the consequences of this recent crisis in Gaza, and then talk a little bit about what this means for the United States in its regional diplomacy under the new administration. I think that there are a few important changes in the region that have led to this re-regionalization, if you will, of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The first and most important one is something we've already heard a bit about this weekend, and that's the rise of Iran as a regional power. Now, Iran has always been an important regional player, and it's always sought to play a role in the Arab-Israeli conflict as well. But for a long time, its influence was relatively limited, and that was mainly because of the containment effects of its long-standing rivalry with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So with Saddam's removal, and with the removal of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan on Iran's other major border, Iran became relatively free and relatively emboldened. I happened to be in Tehran for a conference in March 2003, just a few days before the American invasion of Iraq. And I can tell you that the Iranian foreign policy elites that I was speaking to there were feeling pretty optimistic about their country's future, despite the prospect of having potentially hundreds of thousands of troops, American troops, on their borders. They understood that the regional balance of power was shifting in their favor. And indeed, in the years since 2003, we have seen emboldened Iranian behavior on everything from sending more sophisticated weapons to Hezbollah, to expanding their nuclear program in defiance of the United Nations, to alternately cozying up to and threatening their Arab neighbors across the Persian Gulf. And with the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip in June 2007 and the resulting international efforts to isolate Hamas in Gaza, Iran seized an opportunity to expand its influence in the Arab-Israeli arena. Before that time, Iran had sponsored a small and relentlessly rejectionist terrorist organization in Gaza called the Palestine Islamic Jihad. And Hamas, for its part, had accepted Iranian support, but relied mainly on Arab sources of funds and political support. After June 2007, however, when that Arab support was largely cut off, Hamas became wide open to Iranian aid. Cash, weapons, training, all followed. And today, Hamas is much closer to Iran than ever before. Likewise, Iran's other ally on Israel's border, Hezbollah, has made some strong inroads into Gaza. Hezbollah's attacks on Israel in 2006 earned them popularity and some allegiance from Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. You can see Hezbollah flags flying in Gaza today. And some Hamas fighters have even said that they received military training at Hezbollah camps in Lebanon. So since 2007, the Palestinian population, especially in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well, they've been caught in this battle for political power between Hamas and Fatah that we've read so much about. But increasingly, they're caught in a bigger conflict as well, between two opposing sets of forces in the Middle East. You see, with the emergence of Iran as a newly powerful regional actor, we also had the emergence of a nascent coalition of actors in the Middle East, led by Iran, that's essentially what I would say revisionist in orientation. That is, they don't like the current balance of power in the region. They don't like the current influence of outsiders in the region. They don't like the way decisions are made. And they want to change regional politics to give themselves and their own ideas more influence over events. So you have this revisionist coalition, which is comprised of Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and one foot in and one foot out, I would say, the Syrians as well. So this is a coalition that includes states and non-state actors. And like other revisionist coalitions in the history of the region, in the history of international politics, they're using their ability to play spoiler, to say no, to make things messy, in order to force the status quo powers in the region to give them a greater share of attention and power. So if you listen to the vision of the region that's put forward by people like Hezbollah's spiritual leader, Hassan Nasrallah, or political leader rather, or Iran's president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, they envision a region that is defined by resistance, by defiance against Israel, against the United States, and against status quo Arab governments. Nasrallah and Ahmadinejad argue for the redemptive value of violence. They offer the promise of justice and dignity for Arabs who have been humiliated by decades of defeat at the hands of the West and Israel, and decades of humiliation and neglect at the hands of their own governments as well. So this revisionist coalition has been in formation, and it's now really come out into the open. And against this group of revisionist actors, you have a looser coalition of status quo actors, those who benefit from the current balance of power and are trying to preserve it. That is a coalition that includes the United States, but it's notable that today's status quo coalition in the Middle East, unlike any in the Middle East's modern history, includes nearly all the major Arab states alongside Israel. To moderate Arab leaders, as Secretary Rice used to refer to them, people like Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak, Jordan's King Abdullah II, Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah, all of them associates of the United States. To these folks, the Iranian-led revisionist challenge is deeply threatening on several levels. Even on the streets of their own cities, these leaders are less popular than Nasrallah and Ahmadinejad. The radicals' message of resistance is always combined with denunciations of these Arab leaders for cowering under an American security umbrella, for making humiliating deals with Israel, and for ignoring the plight of their own people. And this brings me to another important change in the region, which is the rise of domestic politics. General Scowcroft was talking about this at a global level last night when he said people across the world are more politicized than they used to be. And this is just as true in the Middle East. So these status quo Arab actors, these allies of the United States, are under assault at several levels. They're under assault for the failure of their strategy of moderation and negotiation to produce justice for Palestine. They're under assault for their association with American foreign policy in Iraq and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And they're under assault for their own domestic corruption and repression and stagnation. And so there's a blending and a mutual reinforcement of the critique of Arab governments that comes from these radical revisionist voices outside their borders, and the critique that comes from their domestic Islamist opposition inside their borders. As I said, this balance of forces in the region, these opposing coalitions, have been in formation for some time. And they really had a sort of a coming out party in 2006 at the time of the Lebanon War. The diplomacy and the developments since that conflict, I think, all represent efforts by these regional revisionists to capitalize on the openings that that conflict created for them, and by the status quo states to recover and try and contain the influence of these revisionist actors. So from my perspective, the Gaza war was just one more skirmish in this regional war for influence. So if you look at the situation in Gaza over the course of the crisis and the fallout from around the region, you can see this in action. America's closest Arab ally, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, caught a tremendous amount of flack from his own population and from other Arab political leaders for keeping the Egyptian border closed with Gaza. There were demonstrations against Egyptian embassies taking place around the Arab world. People protesting what they viewed as Egypt's support for the Zionist assault on Gaza. And who was gaining strength from this crisis regionally? Hamas, yes, but also its allies, Hezbollah and Iran. Hassan Nasrallah may not be prepared to risk sympathy attacks across the Lebanese border into Israel, but he certainly got a lot of sympathy regionally by lambasting Mubarak in public and calling on the Egyptian people to rise up against him. And as I said, Nasrallah has resonance in the Egyptian street, not only because Mubarak is perceived as a lackey of the United States, who serves the interests of the Israelis, but also because of the economic pain and political repression his government inflicts on average Egyptians. So when Gaza is burning, the Islamist opposition in Egypt gains strength. And when the Egyptian police are beating demonstrators who are protesting the Gaza war in Cairo, Hezbollah benefits region-wide. So these are the voices that have gained strength around the region as a result of the Gaza crisis. Now, the emergence of this revisionist coalition, the challenge it presents to Arab states, and this blending of the internal criticism against Arab governments and the external criticism of Arab governments, these present a tremendous problem for US foreign policy for two reasons. First, because in this environment, the post-Bush administration environment facing the US and the Middle East, it's not just American policy that is causing us difficulty. The very legitimacy of an American role or American presence in the region is under attack. This is in part because of Bush's policies, but it's also because of the success, the resonance of this revisionist narrative. It puts under threat America's ability to achieve any of the regional strategic goals that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. Goals like stabilizing Iraq, containing Iran. These goals rely on close cooperation with America's regional allies. And it's very hard for them to cooperate with us when our very involvement in the region is perceived as harmful and illegitimate. Now, the second problem is that in today's Middle Eastern environment, as I've suggested, we really can't draw a clear line anymore between the domestic problems plaguing Arab governments and the regional security problems that are plaguing the United States and our allies. They are now two halves of the same coin. And in this latest crisis in Gaza, as I suggested, they were once again interacting in ways that are harmful to our interests and to the future stability of the region. Now, as I said, we have a dilemma here. Because of these regional dynamics, because of the problems the United States faces in the region and the goals it wants to achieve, America and her major Arab partners need one another more than ever. Close cooperation with Arab states is required to solve our urgent problems in the region. And close cooperation with Arab states will continually be required to secure our long-term interests. Likewise, Arab rulers need our assistance on the same set of issues. They continue to work with us, despite their frustration at our policies, despite their public's anger at us, because they share basic interests and goals with us in the Middle East. But Arab states are cooperating with the United States in the face of unprecedentedly high levels of public anti-American resentment and anger, and in the face of increasing discontent from their rising young generation. Someone mentioned population growth in our last session, and it's worth noting that literally half of the population of the Arab world are children. They're under the age of majority. And this presents a tremendous rising challenge for these Arab governments to accommodate the needs and the aspirations of this rising generation. So US-Arab cooperation can't reliably be sustained in an environment where our partners are implicated by our unpopular foreign policy, and we are implicated by their unpopular domestic policies, and both reinforce the arguments of the region's most radical and violent voices. Washington and the Arab capitals right now are like two donkeys tied together on a cart, to use an old Middle Eastern analogy. Neither of them can stand without the other's help, and neither of them can escape unless the other is also free. So if we don't help each other, we're both in trouble, and we know it. But escaping from the bind that the United States and its Arab friends are in the Middle East today requires several things that seem to be in short supply in 2009. First, it requires a commitment to sustaining our investments when many weary Americans would prefer to walk away from the table. It requires new investments in issues like Arab-Israeli diplomacy, even though the returns are likely to be meager at best. And it requires a commitment to the long term, despite the urgency that many feel for quick results. Here are three elements of policy that I think are imperative for the United States in this challenging period ahead. First, and we've already heard a lot about this, a renewed effort at Arab-Israeli peacemaking. Not because the situation is ripe for resolution. It most certainly is not. But because a peace process is an important part of containing this regional revisionist set of forces. A peace process is especially important to block the efforts of Iran to plant both feet firmly in the heart of the Levant. A peace process is necessary to transform the Arab-Israeli conflict again from a conflict that runs at the whim of regional dynamics to a conflict that is left to the national interests of the parties at its core to resolve. Now, a peace process might also be useful for the United States for public relations purposes, to help repair America's battered approval rating, to repair America's reputation. But it won't solve all the problems of the Middle East. Most concretely, a peace process is important because it creates tensions and disagreements among the members of this revisionist coalition. It weakens their impact on the region and on our regional allies and interests. This is especially true, I think, if Israel and Syria resume negotiations, and if Syria can be given real incentives to, if not split itself entirely off from this revisionist coalition, weaken its ties to Iran, to Hamas, and Hezbollah. I think the Obama administration understands this imperative and understands that the Middle East peace process is about more than moral imperatives and public diplomacy, but will help concretely advance America's interests in the region at this time. So that's the first leg of this stool. The second leg is, I think, maybe a little bit tougher for many Americans to swallow. And that is, we need a continued American commitment to security in the Persian Gulf. Now, many people have said that Russia and China are asserting themselves in this region. China's oil needs are driving it to greater diplomacy in the Gulf. The United States has perhaps demonstrated that it's not popular in the Persian Gulf, that its military engagements there ultimately don't produce enough gains. And so some suggest that the United States should stand off from the Gulf. But the fact is that these other major powers, whether it's Russia or China or the European Union, the major consumers of Persian Gulf oil, none of them are able or willing to play the role that the United States, mostly militarily, has been playing in the Gulf for the last 30 years, the role of security guarantor, the one that protects the free flow of oil to global markets. None of these countries is eager to take over the job or necessarily able to take over the job. The only country that is interested is Iran. And I think there's an international consensus that they might not be the best guarantor. So the United States has to continue to play this role. The United States has to keep the Gulf open for all. I'm fairly confident that with international cooperation of the kind we've been discussing, this can be done peacefully. But it does require concerted multilateral diplomacy to deal with the Iranian nuclear program, to deal with Iraqi stabilization, and to help the Arab states of the Gulf build the capacity and the will to play a greater role in their own security. Again, the regional tensions exposed by the Gaza crisis heighten the urgency for the Arab states of tackling that problem. But finally, and in some ways I think most importantly, we need to put American policies in the Middle East, policies on Iran, on Iraq, on the Arab-Israeli conflict, into a wider context, a context that explains to the region in a compelling way what it is we're there for, beyond our own narrow interests. The new administration has to recognize the integral relationship between domestic and regional politics in the Middle East. And it has to present a policy vision that integrates them by setting out a vision for a new American role in the Middle East, one that works for peace, but also works for prosperity and progress, including political freedom for Arab citizens all across the region. Essentially, we have to demonstrate how our renewed diplomacy is going to help us play a positive role and build a positive future for the region. And we can't realistically talk about how we view the future of the Middle East without addressing the governance problems that affect 250 million Arab citizens every day and that are topmost on their priority list. In many ways, the appeal of radicalism in the region lies in its ideology of revolutionary resistance to the stagnation and suffering in many Arab societies today. To counter that ideology effectively, we have to have a positive alternative vision of the future, one in which moderation, tolerance, and peace provide more benefits and opportunities than resistance and violence. As I said, that does suggest the value of efforts at Arab-Israeli peace. But it also suggests the need to present to the vast majority of Arabs who live outside Palestine the opportunity to shape their own future as well. And that's a promise that can only be fulfilled through far-reaching political, economic, and social reforms that will create a new relationship between Arab governments and their citizens. Now, Arab leaders feel keenly the threats of these revisionist forces, the threats from radicalism within their own societies and from outside their borders. They know that their opposition has capitalized on state failures and weaknesses. They know that the critique put forward by their local opposition is magnified by the rising popularity of Iran and its allies. In this insecure environment, I think American efforts to persuade at least some Arab leaders of the need to reform should resonate, if it's part of a broader regional agenda, and if it's accompanied by the right kind of incentives. For now, most Arab regimes believe that the best way to manage the threat they face is to focus on resolving regional conflicts, like Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, and that this will relieve them of the burden of addressing domestic grievances. While, as I said, I think the United States should work with them to resolve these regional conflicts, we need to help them understand that the best insulation against the destabilizing effects of rising radicalism is to repair the frayed social contract between citizens and the state. So, as I said at the outset, the bad news in the Arab-Israeli conflict is that the conflict is, once again, subject to the broader forces of regional politics. And the Gaza crisis demonstrated this quite clearly. The good news, though, is that this heightened salience for the Arab-Israeli conflict is focusing the minds of our regional partners and focusing the attention of the United States as well. My hope is that with that new focus among Arabs and Israelis alike will come a new emphasis on the urgency of making diplomatic progress toward a lasting Middle East peace. Thank you very much.